Welcome back, everyone. This is the Changelog, and I'm your host, Adam Stacoviak. This is episode 188, and today is a special show. It's a combo show. We have two shows in one just for you for Christmas holiday. Hope you enjoy it. The first part of the call, we're talking to Andrew Nesbitt about 24 pull requests and also libraries.io. And in part two, we're catching back up with Jonathan Rudenberg, the creator of Flynn, a next-generation application platform. We had four awesome sponsors for the show: CodeShip, TopTal, DigitalOcean, and also Harvest. Our first sponsor is CodeShip. In the new year, January 12th, they have a free webinar you have to check out. CodeShip's engineer Laura Frank is going to give an overview of Docker's ecosystem, Docker Compose, Docker Machine. She's going to talk about containers, and you'll learn about Docker images, why they're so powerful, and how you can start running services in containers. And when it comes to web apps and Docker, you'll understand how to develop your web apps using Docker, working with images, registries, and running services in containers. The link to this webinar is rather long, so I'm going to put it in the show notes. But you can also go to resources.codeship.com and look for webinars in that list. And it's going to link to the same webinar I'm talking about. Or head to the show notes and click the link there. Again, totally free, January 12th, 2016, from noon Eastern Standard Time to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's 1 hour. And now on to the show. Hey everyone, we're here with Andrew Nesbitt. Andrew is an open source software developer, has done lots of cool stuff, 24 pull requests, libraries.io. And Andrew, you got a longer list than I could even say here right now, but we'll talk about some of these things. But when you come on a show like this, how do you introduce yourself?
As I guess like an open source enthusiast.
Okay.
I kind of built my career off the back of lots of other people's open source work. So kind of the kickstart for the whole thing was WordPress and teaching myself some Ruby on Rails. So it feels like I've been kind of standing on the shoulders of giants for a long time, and I've got to the point where I feel like I can now start to really contribute back and kind of give back based on the things that I've been using for years, to the point where I try and do that all the time now, if I can.
Let's get a little history of you then. I guess, sometimes what we like to do on this show is figure out where someone came from to kind of make sense of and even establish more credibility to what they're doing now. So where did things begin for you as a programmer?
So I originally didn't get into programming. I went down the robotics route.
Okay.
At university, I thought I'll try and do something slightly different than just computing. And robotics turned out to be basically just advanced math all the way through. Every part of it just comes down to math, which at the time I didn't find particularly interesting. I ended up actually kind of setting up a blog, and then wanting to customize the blog and basically self-taught myself enough kind of web programming on the side of doing my robotics course. When I finished the university degree, I was so kind of involved in the web stuff that I was doing, just getting into Ruby on Rails about 9 years ago. And it kind of went from there. Like I was able to pick that up much easier than the robotics kind of very industrial, very hard to get into, which it's definitely changed now, but back kind of 9 years ago was very difficult to really get your teeth into and learn, like in this way that open source helps programmers to pick stuff up really easily, just because so much code is available. In the robotics world, it's really not like that at all.
Yeah, it seems like robotics might be a little bit easier nowadays, and some might even call that Internet of Things or what have you. There's probably robotics is obviously one term for it, and then attachment to that might be IoT or whatever. What do you think about it now? Do you think, man, I can, I've got all this other skills now, considering your path with Ruby on Rails and Ruby and the things you've been involved with? Have you had some second thoughts about going back to robotics?
So over the last couple of years, I've definitely dipped back into it, especially around the nodecopter movement, where you can get a para AR drone and it runs a little BusyBox Linux install on board, and it's a Wi-Fi hotspot. You can connect it with your MacBook, turn it into it, and there's a nice kind of API that you can talk to over UDP. There's a little node module for essentially telling it like take off, land, do flips, and you can even stream the video back to a web browser. All of this stuff is open source, and it's really easy to get into. Obviously, you still run into like the fact that physics isn't very easy to program against, and the real world has a lot of things that are much harder to program for than like in a browser environment. If you run out of range and your drone hasn't been told to stop, it just carries on until it hits something.
Yeah, I see the core team here on nodecopter.com, and Felix Geisendorfer has been on this show before, way back in the day. It's been probably 130 shows since we've seen the likes of Felix around here, but I also see you as the core team, so you're part of that.
Yeah, so I managed to get a number of drones basically by getting companies to sponsor a drone for an event.
Right.
And I ran a number of events around the UK, the UK being much smaller than like the US. I could drive from one end of it to the other in a day, and I would kind of lug 10 drones around, take them to a big space like a sports hall, and then say like, okay, 30 programmers a day, see what you can do with them. Fix them up at the end of the day and then drive them off somewhere else.
So part of this give back mentality you have, just kind of thinking, is this something when they sponsored is it something that you were doing as like a paid thing, or was this because you were just in love with robotics in the community?
It was just a brilliant kind of small community of lots of people who had never really had that experience before, and to enable that, we did a number of things with Coder Dojo as well,
right?
Which was basically like kids who had just enough JavaScript to be dangerous, just unleash them on the drones, give them some example code, and then let them change and copy and paste bits so that they can actually start the drones doing kind of like maneuvers and trying to fly them around in a square in the room. You can imagine how crazy it starts to get when you've got like 30 kids flying 10 drones in one room.
Yeah.
With JavaScript.
Well, especially when you think about things like you'd mentioned before, where you can. I'm familiar with Nodecopter, the project, and the syntax and whatnot. Like if you're just telling it to to do a clockwise turn or to go forward 10 feet, you don't know if there's another kid there or another copter there or a wall there, so it could be kind of dangerous.
Yeah, so that's where the kind of the robotics aspect starts to come back into it. Once you've got the basics, then you're like, okay, well, I need to learn about feedback, and then I need to learn about control algorithms, and you get quickly back into that math that I was talking about earlier. That the initial kind of your first time at a Nodecopter event is great because you can start to do the simple things, but when you really start to get into it, your kind of progress slows down. You hit a wall of like, oh, actually, some of this is really hard. So the open source side comes back and kind of saves you, where people with more experience have built things that you can then go and like read the source and go, oh, okay, I understand a little bit how this works now based on what someone else has actually already done and shared. Whereas in the traditional robotics community, it's all kind of proprietary enterprise software that is written in C++ and not particularly user-friendly.
So when I'm at your homepage, which is yourlastname.io, and we look down at least the code you have listed here. I'm not on your GitHub repo or your GitHub profile, but libraries, IO is on there, Split, Node SAS, 24 pull requests, contributor, first pull request, which is kind of interesting, first pull request, Broodler, Xbox controller, Hipster News, and Lanyard, an unofficial wrapper for the Lanyard API. I don't see anything in there for Nodecopter or anything on the robotics side. Is there any plans for anything on that front for you?
So I've done different pieces. A lot of the code that I wrote for that is on my GitHub account and is quite experimental. It's like the basics to get you started with, say, plugging an Xbox controller into Node and then using the output from that to control the drone. So rather than contributing directly to the Nodecopter code, I did a lot more essentially working with other people, pairing with them to get them started, which doesn't really show up on my GitHub account so much.
Right. What is your current situation now with Nodecopter? Anything happening there? Any new events coming up?
There isn't much happening right now. The core team has kind of disbanded off in different directions. Felix is doing a lot of Go,
Yes,
and lots of there's still a lot of good Nodecopter related things going on. Chris Williams of JSConf has got the new Parrot drones. I forget what they're called. It's like, I think it's the Rolling Spider, much smaller,
okay.
more affordable drone.
I was thinking Bebo or the Bembo or something like that.
Yeah, well, those ones work on the same protocol. So
Bebop.
yeah, that's it, with the kind of wide view camera on the front of it. They all work over this new protocol, and the Rolling Spiders are over Bluetooth, which is much harder to reverse engineer than the Wi-Fi kind of UDP protocol that you could just listen to.
Right. That's interesting to hear your take and background in robotics and Nodecopter. It's a shame that the core team's kind of disbanded, as you mentioned, because I was always a fan of that project, and several times on this show, the hero of people has been Jim Wyrick, and he's had a lot of influence in that front too, and it's just a really fun project. And I didn't know about the Coder Dojo piece where you're actually working with children and kids doing this stuff. I think it's just like a fun way, like you said before, of having that heart of giving back.
Yeah.
Whether it's just open source, but also to people too,
And for a kid, rather than like a console log as your output, to actually get like a robot to take off and hover in the air, even if it's almost identical code,
right?
It's just the most engaging way to get someone interested in programming.
Absolutely. I mean, it's, you talk about real world response, an actual thing they can touch and throw or play with or whatever, that they can, later on when they're actually programming it, they can actually still hover it in their own hand like they would any toy. But to be able to actually write a few, characters on a screen or new words they're learning, and bam, it starts working. That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, let's tail off to that and talk about your project, 24 Pull Requests. That's 24pullrequests.com. And this show is coming out in the Christmas holiday season, so I thought it would make sense, even though we're kind of late to the ball, so to speak, because the basic idea of this is to send 24 pull requests between December 1st and December 24th.
Right.
And that's such an interesting idea. I think it's been around for at least 3 or 4 years, if I can remember. So what is this project to you?
Yeah, so I think it's the 4th year it's been running. And it started out as not even really like, it was more of an idea and a challenge, just as like, why don't you try and do this? It didn't have any kind of code behind it. It was just the original web page. You go back and look at like the first commit on the repo. There's a single HTML page that just says like, try and do 24 pull requests, doing like on the 24 days up to Christmas. And that came from a blog that only runs in those same days called 24 Ways.
Yes, I thought that might be influenced by that.
Yeah, absolutely loved it. But as a developer, which they've got a lot more developer articles now, but back 4 years ago, it was very much design focused. And as a developer, I kind of felt like, I'd love to do something like this, but maybe a bit more code related. And I thought, well, why not? 24 pull requests has a nice ring to it. Can I get people to send 24 pull requests? Like, that's quite an ask.
Right.
But if we can get lots of people doing it, then you're more likely to go like, yeah, let me try and do this as well. Like, everyone else seems to be contributing back. And it's kind of every year doubled the amount of people and the amount of pull requests since it first started, which has blown me away. I didn't expect it to have that kind of response.
Well, so I mean, I guess if you did it on a whim, so to speak, in a way to pay some homage to 24 Ways, what was your initial, your initial expectation? What were you thinking at first? Really
just wanted to see what other people thought of it. Is this crazy idea, or is it something reasonable? Like, to actually give, if you've been using all of this open source code throughout the year, to actually try and go, okay, well, I'm going to try and contribute back a patch to all of the kind of maintainers who have been supporting my work throughout the year. Can I help them by fixing a bug or making an improvement to one of the libraries that I use, which then will in turn help me by improving the quality of the code that I depend upon.
And you make it pretty easy too, because you have login with GitHub, so pretty easy credentials there. And I think you ask for some very, very sparse, I guess, what do you call that? Authentication back to GitHub.
Yeah.
You're only asking for like your basic public profile. It's not even asking for much really in terms of, clicking one button, using your existing GitHub profile and getting access to this dashboard, which shows off various languages and ways that I'm assuming that you're probing the community based on what they prefer. You're saying, hey, these are projects out there that could use some help.
Exactly. So the GitHub login is something that came along like after a little while when people said, well, we're already doing this. All the work is happening on GitHub. Like, can we start tracking and kind of showing this as some kind of an advent calendar? So you get like on your profile page, a little calendar that shows the pull requests that you sent on different days. And we detect the languages that you've used on the repos that you have or that you've contributed to on GitHub, and automatically suggest projects that match with the languages that you have some experience with. And the projects are submitted by the community or the maintainers themselves. So you can do a pull request to any GitHub repo, and that will count. But the ones that we send an email to you to go, would you like it? There's so many days left till Christmas. Here are 3 projects that match languages that you've said you're interested in. Why don't you try and send a pull request to one of these today?
I think it's really interesting too, especially the fact that you're fetching stuff I've already contributed to and saying, well, hey, because I didn't even notice that, but you had selected, I'm more of a front-end developer than a back-end developer. So you got things like, SAS and CSS related, JavaScript related. And I didn't even quite notice that I thought they might just be smart defaults, but they're actually based on my behaviors on public activity in GitHub.
Yeah. So I used to work at GitHub, worked there for almost a year and kind of had it was actually how it kind of got me the job because I'd been doing all this good stuff with 24 pull requests. And so it hooks nicely into the bits of information you have without being too kind of over the top and going
right.
Like, we know all about you and we're not going to pull way too much information in.
I think what's interesting too is you've got at least now it seems you've got some sponsors to help make this possible. So what kind of sponsors do you have, and what roles do they play in making 24 pull requests possible each year?
The majority of the sponsorship comes around the services, third-party services that we use to keep the site running. So Heroku, specifically Heroku Postgres, has sponsored it every year to cover the build during December. Outside of December, the site basically shuts down. It stops tracking pull requests. It stops kind of running any background tasks. So I can scale it down to one free dyno and a small database, and it doesn't cost any money. But over the past few years, it shows up on Hacker News, and suddenly the traffic goes wild. Had to scale it up to a couple dynos or add in a little bit of caching, and Heroku Postgres covers most of the cost of those things. DN Simple jumped straight in on the first kind of week and said, do you want to use our DNS? We'll cover the cost for, I think they've covered the cost for 20 years or something.
Wow.
of DNS and domain name. And then we send a lot of emails. I think last year we sent kind of close to 100,000 emails during the 24 days. So got in touch with SendGrid last year, and they basically covered the cost of sending those emails through SendGrid, and they've come back and covered it again this year.
That's awesome.
So it covers the costs aren't huge, but it means that no one has to worry that there's any kind of financial pain that could happen from the site getting too popular.
Right. Well, I mean, most importantly, this is something that you've started as a part of your love for giving back to open source and, just finding more and more ways to include people and share. And it would suck to have you have, a $500 bill every December to make this possible. While you may or may not be able to afford it, it's very interesting to see DN Simple, Bugsnag, SendGrid, Roku Postgres, and the last one here is Psychic.js, just to see them step in and say, hey, we care enough too to get these services for free.
Yeah, I've loads of support, and not necessarily always financial support, but having people from each year, there's a few people who step up to kind of help triage the issues and the pull requests that come in. We've had so far, looking on the GitHub page, 175 contributors to the 24 pull requests repository, the main project, which is kind of overwhelming during the period of December, the amount of activity that happens on the repo for what is essentially a side project.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly an interesting project to us, and like I said, I've been watching it for a couple of years now, and every year I'm thinking, I don't think about it until December, and then it comes around, and it's like, oh, I would love to talk to this guy, and so finally we were able to, 4 years later, sync up with you and sort of cover this. So
it's great. I've been listening. I remember listening to the changelog way back when Win was on it as well.
Yeah.
Good times.
Good times. Yeah, we miss Win around here. He's at GitHub doing his awesome stuff on the API, being an API junkie, as he likes to say. So we miss Win around here.
He's fixed a few bugs for 24 Progress where we try and get the best way to pull in the pull request for a user over a given time period. Which there's different ways of doing it, and now we're using the GitHub Firehose, the event feed, to try and pull in your pull request as soon as you open it, which is pretty neat. So as soon as within maybe 10 seconds of you opening your pull request on GitHub, it shows up on 24 pull requests.
Well, cool. Let's take a break real quick. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about contributing, what that means in 24 pull requests, how that kind of works. We'll come back. We'll talk a bit more about 24 pull requests, and then we'll move on to libraries.io and all that's going on with package management. So we'll be right back. Our friends at TopTal launched a scholarship program for female developers to support aspiring female computer scientists, developers, and software engineers to help achieve their goals through financial support and also mentorship. Each scholarship winner will receive a $5,000 scholarship that can be used towards education and professional development goals. You can spend this money on anything you want, from coding boot camps to online programming courses, textbooks, you name it. You also get one-on-one mentoring, an entire year of weekly one-on-one mentoring with a TopTal senior developer, and this person is going to help you with topics like project guidance, choosing an academic or career path, and also preparing for interviews. Head to toptal.com/scholarships to learn more and also to apply. All right, we're back again from the break with Andrew Nesbitt, and we've been talking about 24 pull requests, an interesting way to give back to open source during the holiday season here at Christmas. So between December 1st and December 24th, Andrew and the rest of the gang that's a part of this is asking everyone to find ways to give back to open source that matters to them. So Andrew, the next part I'd like to talk about on this is ways people can contribute. On your contributing page, you have guides and things like that. Where did this come from, and how do you guide people into contributing? Is it people who are new to GitHub or new to open source? Who are you trying to reach when it comes to this?
So initially it was aimed at people who use a lot of open source, and I kind of felt like, as someone who uses a lot of open source myself, that I should be actively trying to contribute to some of these projects. But it's kind of moved towards much more of a way of making it kind of okay to get into open source, because so many people are doing it at the same time and sending their first pull requests as part of 24 pull requests.
Right.
That it's moved towards okay, well, you can get started here and then continue. And we've got a Gitter chat room which is full of really friendly people. So people will hop in and go I'm not sure where to send my first pull request. Can you give me some tips? Here are some things that I'm interested in. And other people will be able to point them in the right direction, help them rebase their branches, and do all the kind of learn about all the different pieces involved in contributing to a project.
I see also has some other ways to find projects, and not only just ways that 24 pull requests is using that GitHub login to, kind of get to know who's logging in and allowing them also to choose their own ways. But you also mentioned several of the places like Code Montage, Code Triage, and a couple others. How do you find this list? And if someone out there is like, hey, I have a similar site, how do they go about getting in touch with you? Is the site forkable? Can someone update the site themselves and send a pull request for this?
Absolutely. The all of the pages are part of it's a Ruby on Rails application, and there's kind of a static controllers section that has all of this content in it. So you can, if you have some kind of site that will help people to be able to get into sending pull requests, contributing to open source, definitely open up a pull request, or even just an issue and say, like, can you add this to the contributing page? All of the projects that are listed on the contributing page also get shown on the homepage when it's not December. So because 24 pull requests doesn't really do anything for you outside of Christmas, it goes, here are some other different ways of getting involved or finding out about projects that might be useful for you.
You mentioned that another way this is kind of morphed over the years or changed over the years is originally it was sort of focused on those who use a lot of open source and encouraging them to give back during this season, and now kind of transitioning into a way to help people get involved in open source. And you have another project called First PR, which I actually used about a month ago when I first kind of picked up this conversation internally here. And I was like, that's pretty interesting. And I went and looked at my first pull request and I was like, that's embarrassing. So I don't know about you, but my first pull request is kind of embarrassing.
It's a good way of seeing what kind of your heroes, how they got started sending their first pull request. And that may not be their first ever open source contribution. It only works from the introduction of pull request 2.0 on GitHub, which is, I guess, kind of like 5 years ago or so. But for a lot of people, it'll be their first time that they've contributed code to a project or documentation if it's part of the GitHub repo, which I think a lot of projects have started to move their documentation out of wikis and into repositories so that they have a good way of managing and encouraging that same kind of collaboration and review.
Yeah, I never really cared for wikis not being, well, I don't care for how the wikis are actually set up. I actually prefer an actual repo for it, and that whole method to me just seems a bit better for docs.
Yeah, definitely. And it aligns with all the similar kind of things. You could set up essentially Travis tests to check for typos and different things if you wanted to, or have those docs automatically published to GitHub pages when you merge the pull request.
So before we transition this conversation to libraries.io, is there anything else about 24 pull requests that the community needs to know about that we didn't cover?
So I think we covered most of it. If you're interested in actually helping move the site forwards or implementing like other functionality, I'm always open for that. Most of the code now is kind of being written by someone else for the project. I like to say that I've lost control of it. And if you're interested in either helping triage issues or kind of make improvements across the site, especially for translation, the site has been translated into like 16 different languages, completely done by open source contributors. And if you want it in your language, then dive in. It's using standard Rails like I18N translation, so it's easy to pick up that one file and translate it into another language, and enable that for everyone else who speaks that language to have a better experience with contributing to open source.
Very cool. And that's on its own org too. So it's github.com/24 pull requests /24 pull requests. That's where the actual Rails app repo's at. All right, let's talk about, well, obviously there's some pricing here, so I can't tell if this is your startup. What is libraries.io to you?
The libraries I've been working on it for about 8 months as another side project, which is kind of like, how can I, given the incredible range of open source libraries, if I want to compare a load of them to work out what is the best Redis client, if I'm writing some Node, that was kind of how it initially started. I wanted to index every open source library into one place in a standard format so that I could have a good quality search that bubbled the best projects to the top so that I could be sure that I was making the right decisions when picking a dependency. And from there, it's kind of wildly expanded and gone off in lots of different directions. Now pulling out the dependencies for every library as well, and essentially building out a graph of the dependency network for each package manager. And I think it supports about 29 different package managers at this point, and about 1.1 million different libraries.
That's quite a bit.
Yeah, so it's
that's a lot.
Slightly grown beyond a side project, but it currently doesn't really make any money to support itself. So I've just started to look into ways of making it be able to support itself so that I can spend more time on it with some private repository tracking. So how that works, and it works exactly the same for open source and is completely free. You can log in with your GitHub account, and it will, given any repository, it will pluck out all the dependencies across every different package manager that it supports. So you might have a package.json and a gem file and maybe even a bower.json. It will find all the dependencies in that repo, and it will tell you whenever there's a new version of one of those things that's released. But rather than just doing it at that snapshot, it will also hook into GitHub and go, whenever you add a dependency or remove a dependency, I'll automatically start watching that as well. So you've got this kind of real-time view of everything that your application depends upon. And then you can be notified about anything that happens related to those dependencies. So say that one is marked as deprecated, or it has a license change, or potentially even removed from the package manager. So there's like a good 7,000 libraries that have been removed from NPM since I started tracking NPM about 7 months ago, which is crazy. You think, I'm just going to do an NPM install and something is gone. You imagine if that happens whilst your machine is auto-scaling, say it's making a new version of another server in your cluster. If it does an NPM install during that process, that is just going to be a huge pain.
Yeah.
Libraries just tries to give you that total view of everything that you use in a way that is essentially only going to tell you about things when they change, rather than you having to remember to go and review your dependencies on a regular basis.
Can you talk about the real world example? I'm assuming there was some sort of pain you personally felt. You mentioned the original version of the idea and how it's scaled since then, but when you started to get towards more of the model it's in now, which is, tracking all these different package managers and dependencies and all that you mentioned that it does, what are some of the real world problems that you faced yourself that led you to build this?
Well, so running a number of open source projects like 24 per request and a number of Rails apps as well, having either internally or as private repos or open source projects, the amount of times like, oh, there's a new version of Rails, which applications do I need to go and update to make sure that I pick up whatever changes are made, or potentially there may be performance fixes that, unless I'm actively going to look for all of these changes, like there's no good way for me to know when something moves in the transitive dependency tree of that application. And over time, especially working in node projects, the size of that dependency tree is getting bigger and bigger and bigger as people depend on more and more libraries, and those libraries depend on more and more libraries, that I just didn't feel like I had good visibility on all of the code that I depend upon. So if one of those things breaks, I really may not even realize for a good few weeks before I'm actually go back and review those things. So I felt like I had no idea of all the code that I was depending on. And I wanted to be able to kind of get a hold of that and then start to automate it, because otherwise it just becomes kind of a collection of scripts which are useful to me, but they should be useful to everyone else as well.
Right.
At the same time, picking all that data up and using it for the search engine, So it feeds in things like the number of projects that depend upon a particular project. So it will highlight the projects that are highly depended upon in a community. For example, imagine you're looking for libraries to convert XML to JSON in Node, that there could be 10 different options to do that. Probably the one you want is the one that is depended upon the most by the community, which works basically the same as the Google PageRank, where the site that gets the most links to it is essentially being kind of crowdsourced as the source of, it's a trusted website.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And then that passes down as well. So if Ruby on Rails depends upon a small library like MIME types, then you can pass a lot of that authority that Ruby on Rails is a trusted, high quality project. Therefore, if it depends upon MIME types, that must be pretty good as well, even if people don't depend on it directly as much.
Interesting. And so, with it being a discovery service, I'm just going through the UI itself. It seems like it's a lot of manual drilling, or you can actually search. How do you feel about where it's at right now? What is the utility of going to the site and searching or poking around? What is the true value there for those that are listening, going there and checking it out?
The real valuable bits that I see people using is, given any application, you can see a snapshot straight away of all of the dependencies without having to go poke around in different files and work out which versions of which thing I'm currently using, and potentially any warnings. So you can go to, if you're logged in, or we could look at the 24 pull request repo.
Okay.
And basically the URL structure is libraries.io/GitHub, and then the name the owner/name. So it mirrors the GitHub URL structure after that first segment. And that will show you the list of dependencies for that repo, along with any potential warnings, the licenses of those things, the current latest version. So you can get a good view of if you've got anything that's out of date or potentially has a conflicting license, which is a whole area that I've only just started to touch on, but say MIT projects that depend upon GPL libraries, which is a gray area, potentially means that that project needs to be relicensed as GPL, considered like a derivative work, or that it needs to swap out that dependency with something else. And for companies, the kind of like license and licensing compliance stuff can cost a lot of money to have that reviewed manually, or even get like a lawyer involved. That if you can get a good view of like, oh, we seem to have like a conflicting license here, let's just swap that out soon before we become really dependent upon that particular library.
I'm also noticing in the Explorer area in your footer, you have a bus factor.
Oh, yes, I love the bus factor.
It's a fun term to throw around anyways. It's, so for those of you listening, like, what is a bus factor? At least the way I know it is if you're the only person that has onus of something, that if for some reason you got hit by a bus and you couldn't come into work today, how would we pick up and carry on? Is that pretty much what you mean by this?
Exactly, yeah. How many people in your team need to get hit by a bus before the project is essentially disabled or can't move any longer?
So when you pull back this list of improve the bus factor, does that mean that there's not enough contributors, not enough?
Yeah, so it looks at the number of contributors to that library, which basically connects through to GitHub, and will go, and it'll order by the projects that are depended upon by the most, either other libraries or applications, and then ordered by the lowest number of contributors. So most of the time it will show like, here's a project that's depended upon by 200 projects and has one guy who's done all of the commits, which basically means if he stops working on it, or if he decides to delete it because he's burnt out, then that's 200 projects that could potentially just be made unusable. So it's a good way to kind of go like, well, here are some places that essentially are a weak spot in your dependency tree. Maybe you should like offer a helping hand or try and get him to share the commit bit with a few other people just to make sure that this is like a key piece of infrastructure essentially in the open source world that we need to make sure continues to work, even if that guy is not interested in looking after it, that someone else can come along and make sure that it continues to work.
Well, cool. Let's take one more break. When we come back, I want to talk a bit about the API and the docs you have for that, because it kind of dovetails from that conversation we just had into this, because I'm thinking if you can pull back searches for bus factors, for example, there must be the sky's the limit, so to speak, if you've got enough creativity in your mind on how you can actually use libraries.io to kind of pull all these different dependencies and package managers to really have some fun with it. So I'm imagining that the API is going to power a lot of that. So let's take a quick break. We'll come back and we'll dive deeper into this cool project and the API of it. Right back. I have yet to meet a single person who doesn't love DigitalOcean. If you've tried DigitalOcean, you know how awesome it is. And here at the Changelog, everything we have runs on blazing fast SSD cloud servers from DigitalOcean. And I want you to use the code Changelog when you sign up today to get a free month. Run a server with 1 gig of RAM and 30 gigs of SSD drive space totally for free on DigitalOcean. Use the code Changelog. Again, that code is Changelog. Use that when you sign up for a new account. Head to DigitalOcean.com to sign up and tell them the Changelog sent you. All right, we're back with Andrew talking about libraries.io, and we talked a bit about the bus factor and what that is, and interesting ways you can probe and kind of fine-tooth comb what's available out there in the open source world. And you have this pretty awesome API. Can we talk a bit about the API? How does it work? What do you expect to happen with this?
Yeah, so there's a few different kind of APIs going on at the moment. There's, for all of the searches, there's an RSS feed version of the search. So you can keep track of, say, any new libraries that work with Twilio that are written in CoffeeScript. And that you could plug into your RSS feeder or programmatically consume that to find out about new things that happen. Or there's the more traditional REST API, which is pretty new. And if anyone has any feedback then, or any feature requests, things that it's missing, please do let me know, because it's really only existed for a couple of weeks and I'd love to get more people kicking the tires on it. That would let you essentially pull out all the information about every different library across every different package manager in a very standard way, which is exactly how I envisioned, like, if I wanted to work on an API that worked with all these different kinds of libraries, that I'd need some standard way of talking about them. So it tries to normalize out the differences between different package managers. And there may be some information missing for some package managers, like Bower doesn't really have a good concept of versioning, in that everything is in Git tags in GitHub. There's no real act of publishing a new version of a Bower library. But I've tried as hard as possible to make it completely standard. So you can essentially use the same tools against different package managers. So if someone builds something for one language, then it can be useful to everyone, rather than kind of a siloed effect of people building, say, things just for NPM. All the other communities can also benefit from those kind of things.
And during the break, we had a kind of an interesting conversation too about, I guess, ways this API can be extended and just different fun things. And we talked a bit about, in a way, kind of linting a repository or a pull request whenever someone contributes back. And we talk a bit about some hypothesis, some future ideas, something that maybe it's not even quite there yet. Where do you see this going?
Yeah, so the nexus of where I'm moving towards, the kind of other pieces I'm trying to put into place with the deprecation warnings and the license conflicting warnings and the security vulnerabilities, which are pretty close to getting shipped, is to be able to do that on a snapshot of a branch, or the difference between a branch and master. So you can imagine a service kind of like Travis that hooks into your pull request and goes, okay, you've opened a new pull request to this repo, you've added a dependency in, let me review that new dependency and see if it matches the different options that your organization has decided, like, we're going to follow these. So that might be, we're not going to let you merge any new dependencies that have security vulnerabilities. that match that particular version that you've included, or that have no license that we can find for them, or say have a really high bus factor, like there's only one contributor to this project. That's not necessarily a good thing to depend upon because there's no one else there to support it. And you can imagine actually having like the red-green come out of that, where it goes, yes, your dependencies that you're adding look fine, or no, they don't. You can't merge this PR because it's red. And I can see that being a really helpful thing for open source as well, to kind of, at least I personally don't review every dependency that I add to an application manually, or to look at its transitive dependencies and see, like, is there something that I should be worried about in any of these things? We should be able to do that fairly automatically, and then warn you kind of proactively, don't add this thing to your application because it might cause you pain further down the line.
Do you have any ideas for how someone might list or manage that? Will there be like a libraries file, for example, almost listing somewhat similar to like a gem file, for example, kind of saying this is what we want to keep, or we want to avoid, GPL3, for example, because we're MIT, whatever it might be, or bus factor code, or whatever, however you can kind of like throw in there. How is that going to work?
So I imagined it working by essentially an org level that you'd configure it inside of the libraries IO dashboard, but you could also do it on a per repo basis with like a .librariesio.yaml file, very similar to the way that Travis works, where you can go like, for this repo, actually, it's all running inside a firewall. We don't need to worry about security related things because this is running completely internally and not a problem. Then let's skip all the security warnings. We don't need to worry about that. Or for this project, it's public domain, open source project. It doesn't matter if there's GPL things here or whatever the whitelist of licensing things here. As a little config file that you could overwrite the org-wide setting.
I think it's a really interesting take towards it too. I mean, I was, I have to admit, I was slightly skeptical at first. Like, okay, this is a pretty useful thing, but I wasn't really sure how many people out there would actually, maybe go to the site and check dependencies. And then I was also going to ask questions about the notification process, but I really see the utility in having it, at the developer level where you're, in the command line, you're already, doing pull requests, you're already pushing to your CI server or whatever it might be, and having that real-time feedback whenever you might even be doing a pull request. I really see a lot of usefulness in that utility part of it.
Yeah, you could imagine hooking that into, say, even into Atom, where it could lint the gem file as soon as you saved it. I haven't quite worked out if that is a feasible thing, but the API would allow you to do that anywhere that you would run any other kind of linter. It just might take a little bit longer because it's got to go past. But depending on the language, some programming languages have really nice formats, like all the manifest files are written in JSON or TOML or YAML. Other ones need like to actually run the code in the language that it was written in. Things like Lua and Clojure, all of their manifest files are written in Lua or Clojure, which is difficult to regex out of all the dependencies.
Well, we've been talking about a couple of these features, and some of them are there, and some of them seem like they may be dreams of yours. How far are we away from this linting world as we've been talking about it?
The linting is working internally, and so libraries tracks its own dependencies, which is pretty neat to get the project to be able to kind of eat its own dog food. And it uses a lot of the webhook API as well, so it will open an issue on GitHub, and the webhook API is pretty poorly documented on the site at the moment. But there's a lot of little open source GitHub projects on the libraries IO GitHub org that show you different ways of doing things. So it will rerun its tests automatically every time there's a dependency updated. It will open an issue if there's a dependency that's not a pre-release that's been, the version has been bumped. And it will even potentially, you could have that tweet or post to your Slack room to say, hey, there's a new version of this thing. I've got it tracking and kind of reviewing the dependencies that I add to the project itself, but it needs work mostly around the configuration of the options, as you say. Like there needs to be that YAML file, be able to say, here's the things I care about, which may not be the same as other people. And I reckon it's probably a month away before that's live on the site.
So this is open source focused, but it's not an open source project, right?
Not at the moment, no. I'm trying to work out exactly what to do with that. I'm kind of halfway between the two. I haven't landed on, do I open source it all as, say, like a GPL, or do I continue to run it as a proprietary bit of software? A lot of the pieces of it are open source, but the main Rails app is currently private.
It's certainly interesting, especially whenever you start talking about, I know so many developers and teams are using Slack and obviously using Twitter. So those two mentions of like tweeting to, that seems somewhat okay to me, but I think, maybe a lot of ears perked up when you said Slack integration potentially. So I know for us, anytime we have, here at the Changelog, we have a private kind of activity area where if things happen, things get triggered, and it's an area where Jared and I and the rest of the team, we kind of keep an eye on it. And those are like critical things happening. So if something gets posted there, we know it's not a good thing. It's somewhat of a bad thing, and we get on it right away. So I can kind of see some utility in that too, because, it removes the buzz factor, so to speak, whenever something bad happens. And if you've got a team and you're kind of triggering notifications back into Slack or via email, I'm kind of less interested about email because I think people get a lot of that, but I think Slack seems to be like the next better thing to an email response on a notification.
Yeah, I haven't written a Slack bot for it yet, most because I'm working on this on my own most of the time, and I didn't feel the need to hang out in my own little Slack room. So I have it open issues on GitHub for me instead, but that's definitely something that can be built on the webhook API that's there already. I just really need to write some documentation for the thing. And then you can have that either only post me like major versions or like new big versions updates, or maybe even only go like, I just want to post about any potential security vulnerabilities that are announced on the things that any application across the whole GitHub org depends upon.
Well, I'm not sure if you heard about it yet, but there is a brand new repo as of yesterday when Slack made that announcement about the app store they're having and stuff like that, and this ecosystem and whatnot. They also released a thing called BotKit. Actually, I don't think it was them directly releasing it. It was a team, or I think it's an org on GitHub, and I think it's just Howdy, but it's HOWDYAI, and so on that user, so it's that name /BotKit is the repo. So there's a BotKit out there for a toolkit for building bot applications for Slack. So they may have just made it so much easier for you.
Okay, so maybe by the time that this podcast goes out, there may be a libraries IO Slack bot available.
There you go. Well, we love that. So, I mean, it's also available via NPM, so you're already familiar with that. So it seems like it's, we're actually thinking about doing something like that ourselves around here at the Changelog. I was telling Jerry this the other day, I was like, it would be pretty interesting that if we can have something where it integrated into Slack, and rather than just subscribe to what we do here at the Changelog between our podcast, our email, things we tweet, and different stuff that we plan to do in the future, I was like, it'd be kind of interesting to be able to pipe that into some sort of Slack bot and allow people to subscribe to it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a really interesting way that teams are, hopefully it doesn't get too spammy. That's my only concern, honestly, with that.
If it becomes too noisy, you just fuzz it out in the background.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there's a happy medium that we have to all be mindful of. And that was my only worry with it, was like, should we do this? Are we like just enabling, not that we're spammers, but are we enabling us to become known as maybe spammers because somebody integrated us and another person's like, well, I'm tired of the changelog. I don't know, who knows what, but just always got a toe line of too much noise, not enough signal, and we are always focused on signal around here.
Yeah, maybe having the ability to have the Slack bot only tell you about episodes of the changelog that are about a particular language.
See?
So I could just go, I'm not interested in any Java related changelog episodes. So don't tell me about that to try and reduce the amount of noise.
Yeah. Well, let's, what else could we cover that we may not have covered well enough for libraries before we tail off the call?
I think we've covered things pretty well. So I've not got to the point of I'm balancing on whether to actually turn it into a real business or to turn it into kind of it, because it's built on so much open source and the data should all be open source. Should it be an open source project? How can I make it like continue to support itself? Because it gets quite a lot of traffic now. I think it's like 50,000 visitors a week from Google, which ends up costing money. So I need to have some way of running it. But, do you have any ideas about how I could potentially support that?
A couple ideas might be to potentially find somewhere, I guess, not so much to be employed, but somewhat where it's almost a partnership. So this would benefit someone else really greatly, and they may essentially foot the bill of you being the developer of it and kind of bankrolling it. You essentially become an employee. That can have its own pros and cons. You might even do other ways where you have sponsored things where you're not really, but it really kind of depends on your motives, right? Like if I don't know what you do for your day job or what you're doing for freelance or how you earn your living.
So I do freelance application development and performance tuning and things like that, which is fine. But I'd really like to spend more time on libraries, especially around the side, kind of the area of the bus factor, and there's also an unlicensed libraries page, ways of producing calls to action for in a similar way to 24 pull requests with more focus, like here's some pain points in a community that could be solved or helped with, or here's some maintainers who might need some help because they're completely overwhelmed by the amount of people using their project. Be able to harvest the data inside of libraries for ways kind of as a force multiplier for open source. Given these projects we know are depended on by a lot of people, what ways can we support that project or expose it to people so they're more aware that this project might need some help?
Yeah, it's borderline public service, borderline utility for enterprise or commercial. So there's several different angles for it for sure.
Yeah, there's definitely that angle of enterprises seeing those projects potentially as a center of risk, and so they could, if we can encourage enterprises that really heavily depend on those projects to maybe give some financial support or some developer support. If they have a team of say 200 developers, can one of those developers help to maintain that library for a certain amount of time?
Right,
would be a great way to potentially help solve this current, and I'm pretty sure it's going to get worse, the problem of open source maintainers kind of burning out from essentially giving out all their time for free and getting very little support back.
It is a tough problem to solve, and I've heard before that if it's a hard problem to solve, and you're already trying to solve it, it's good that you're trying to solve it. That's also meaning that you could be heading in the right direction, because anything that's easy isn't worth doing.
Yeah.
Which isn't exactly a perfect saying, but what I mean by that is if it was easy, everyone else would do it too. So it could be something that's very profitable to you. It could be something that's not. But you got to put in the work to do it. And it seems like you're heading down the right path, that's for sure. So I think that I don't have any particular exact advice I can give you here, but what I can say is that if there's listeners out there that have some ideas, how can they get in touch with you? Is it an issue they should open up, or?
So there's an open source GitHub repo on the libraries.io GitHub called support, which is essentially just an issue tracker. Probably the best way to kind of publicly put out those ideas. Or you can get hold of me on Twitter.
Cool. We'll put the link to that repo and issues in the show notes. So if you're listening now, head to the show notes. You'll see a link there to get in touch if you got some ideas. I mean, I think it's really, really interesting. I'm sure there's people listening to the show now thinking that's really interesting. How you can turn it into a business, that's the hard part. Well, here's a chance for you to highlight somebody that's been really influential to you. We asked this question on the show. It's who is your programming hero, and so who's been really influential to you?
I was pondering this today. And there's a few people, but one person stands out in my mind. Who's Despo. She's a developer based in London, and she also helped a lot with 24 pull requests a couple of years ago. And she started a project called CodeBar, which is essentially a movement to help diversity and kind of underprivileged groups to get into programming, focused in the UK. But she kicked it off and kind of completely open sourced everything she was doing and has turned it into like this movement which is sweeping across the UK as a way of saying, like, how can we get more women and more kind of underrepresented groups into programming by producing lots of free courses and tutorials. And everything has been done, and kind of she set herself up as a way that it wasn't dependent on her. So it spread, and I think she's got like 5 or 6 groups now running around the UK on a regular basis that are introducing more and more people into programming. And I think it's just amazing if I can have that kind of impact.
Yeah. So I didn't catch her name exactly, but it's codebar.io if you're listening. What was her name again?
Despo.
How do you say, like, spell that for me?
Despo.
Despo.
She's on Twitter and GitHub as Despo as well.
All right. We're going to put a link to her Twitter account and her GitHub account in the show notes. So if you want to check out Despo, I'm curious to know her full name, her real name. Maybe she's being anonymous for a reason. I like real names. But if you're curious about her and what she's doing, you can go to codebar.io, or you can check out the show notes and find her Twitter links. It's also Despo. So, well, today we're actually doing a little bit different. So this is our unusual holiday episode. We wanted to team up 2 shows we did. So we talked to Jonathan Rudenberg about Flynn about 3 or 4 weeks back, and it wasn't quite long enough of a conversation to have as a full episode. So what we're doing is we're combining this 60-minute show with that 35-minute show. So it's roughly an hour and a half, but that gives us our full-length show. So we've combined 24 pull requests, libraries.io, and Flynn into one single awesome Christmas holiday episode. So hopefully everybody listens to it and really enjoys it. And at this time, we're going to take another break, but it's just the goodbye for Andrew, but it's not the goodbye for the show. So we'll take a break. And when we come back, we're going to be talking to Jonathan Rudenberg. But before we go on that break, Andrew, do you have anything else to say to the audience? Any more advice you want to share back to the open source community?
No, just have a great Christmas holidays.
Well, thank you for coming on the call. We're going to go into the break. When we come back, we're talking to Jonathan about Flynn. Be right back. If you thought Harvest was only about time tracking, check again. Fast invoicing and payments. You can easily create and send invoices and accept payments with PayPal, Stripe, and many more. You got expense tracking without the mess. You got an iPhone or an Android app to go on the go with you. Snap photos of receipts and store them in the Harvest app. You can also connect favorite tools like Slack and use chat commands to start and stop your timers. Head to getharvest.com and start your free trial. And once that trial is over, use our code CHANGELOG to save 50% off your first month. All right, we're back from our break here in this special Christmas holiday episode, part 2, talking to Jonathan Rudenberg, the creator of Flynn, a next generation application platform. Now, Jonathan, the last time you were on the show was December 20th, 2013, nearly 2 years ago. You were on episode 115 most recently, and then once before that again on episode 99. So it's been about 2 years since we caught up with you, caught up with Flynn. So kind of catch us up with the last couple years of Flynn.
Yeah, so we've had several major releases. The most recent was our stable channel, which was a week and a half ago. And it is the first release of Flynn that has an updater that can just update Flynn in place with near zero downtime and is basically good to go. And you don't have to use the nightly, like, bleeding edge release anymore.
So what is this? What is a channel? When you say channel, what does that mean?
Think of it like browser release channels. So
Okay.
Like Firefox has several release channels. There's a release channel, there's a like a beta channel, there's a developer channel, and there's a nightly channel. We currently just have 2 channels. We have a nightly channel and a stable channel, and we may like adjust that. But we're doing this kind of browser style rolling release model where it's like release trains, so you end up with a new release every so often. Currently, we're doing it every week or two, and we're just rolling out a new update. And we're not like we're really concerned about version numbers. We're just rolling stuff out.
So working is all that really matters. You're not caring about, breaking changes in the past.
Yeah. So the goal here is to have backwards compatibility with the past. For now, like quite a ways back. So the command line tool will work with forwards and backwards, and like the dashboard won't break when you update, but and any API integrations that you built won't break. But we'll be adding new APIs in a backwards compatible fashion.
Interesting. So let's, before we go a little bit further, let's kind of break it down for those who didn't catch episode 115 or episode 99, which were awesome episodes. And you weren't alone. You had Jeff Lindsay with you. Is Jeff still part of the picture?
I think he moved on like beginning of 2014. He's been doing all sorts of other stuff with Docker and so on. And we've just been like hyper focused on building a platform that helps you deploy your applications and is super easy to deploy anywhere. So the idea is that you write code as a developer, and getting that code into production currently is really painful. You end up having to duct tape together a whole bunch of components that you might like want to use containers, and now you've got a whole like new set of challenges. And we found that a lot of people were spending a ton of time just working on the deployment and orchestration of their applications. And so our goal is to make it as easy as possible to deploy your applications in a highly available, fault-tolerant way, and not just stateless web applications, but also things like your backing stores. So we have what we call a Postgres appliance, which it is fully highly available. And if you're running across 3 nodes and one of those nodes fails, it'll just keep on working and it won't eat your data, and it's safe to use.
Kind of reminds me a little bit of the conversation we had with Mitchell recently. I'm sure that Auto was kind of interesting for you to see, and it's promising a better deployment process. How does something like Auto fit into this world? Is it a competing thing? Is it a competing ideology?
I'd say it's a competing ideology. So what we have is this this idea that you should not have to worry about how things are deployed on your servers. And I know Auto is doing some of that, but it's doing it slightly differently in that there's a whole bunch of like underlying stuff that you're going to need to know about, like are you using Nginx and how does that hook up to PHP and so on. With Flynn, you may need to worry about that, but probably not. It's just going to work out of the box. And we've got it set up in such a way that you can just go to production right away, and you don't need to worry about the difference between development and staging and production and so on.
I think Auto's not concerned about where you're putting your stuff, whereas it seems like Flynn is more the platform you're deploying to, and part of that platform you're deploying to, you have the ability to deploy as part of this platform. Is that maybe a layman's version of describing it?
I find the whole space just really confusing, and we're trying to unconfuse it.
That's
as
part
much
of the show,
possible.
is to demystify some of this stuff.
Yeah. So I really don't like. I haven't actually used Auto. I've looked at it a bit. If you think of something like Heroku, where you're just like Git pushing your app, and you don't need anything running on your local machine except for Git in that case. But you can also use our web dashboard, which will clone from GitHub. And you don't need to have any local development tools installed on your local machine in order to use Flynn. If you want, you can install the Flynn command line tool and manage your Flynn cluster using that, but you don't have to. You could just like edit your code on GitHub and then go to the Flynn dashboard and click deploy.
So if we rewind back in time a little bit, since you were back December 20th, 2013, episode 115, at that time, your page title on Flynn.io was Open Source Platform as a Service, powered by Docker. Your page title now, which to me, that's just like a little quick description of like a snapshot of who you are.
Yeah.
And now it says the product that Ops provides to developers. But then on your GitHub, it says Next Generation Application Platform. A lot of buzzwords in there, a lot of confusion if you kind of just trace back a bit.
Right.
What does all that mean?
Okay, so originally we were very much designed as a platform that was built around Docker, and it was designed to be a bunch of components that were like easily composable and you could like use a single component without using the whole thing. And what we found is that, well, a few people were interested in the idea of that. Very few people use that in practice. And what people actually want, we talked to many potential users and people that were using what we are like prototypes and our MVPs and so on. And what we found is that everyone just wanted something that let them deploy their apps, and they didn't really care how it worked. So this is very much for if you don't actually like want to think about individual components, Flynn is for you. It's absolutely all open source, and all the components are really easy to wrap your head around, and you can totally modify it if you want, but you don't need to. It just works. That's the idea.
I know before we talked a bit about fundraising, and that line gets a little bit blurred when you talk about where money's coming from. Was it VC funding? Was this private investment from the community with no obligation for return? What can you talk to us a bit about the fundraising version that you've done and what that looks like as your company? Is it a company? What is Flynn behind the actual software?
Yeah, sure. So when we started, we were not a company. We were just a project that had a single web page that said we would like to build a platform along the lines of Heroku, but open source, and you can deploy it anywhere. And that really resonated with especially the Hacker News community. And we ended up raising close to $120,000 just in like kind of a Kickstarter type thing in order to build that. And so then we took that money and we built out an MVP of the platform. And we actually got the whole thing working. You could boot it up in a VM and deploy. And we decided that we wanted to like take it much further than that to be like actually production ready and like much more full featured. So we evaluated a few options. We talked to a lot of the original contributors and some new ones, and we found that there wasn't a whole lot of interest in putting like more Kickstarter style money into it. So around that time, that was in 2014, the beginning of 2014. We applied to Y Combinator, which is a startup accelerator in Silicon Valley, and we got in. And so we did a seed round in the summer of 2014, and we hired a team. And so Flynn is actually Prime Directive Incorporated, and we make Flynn, which is entirely open source, and we will. It's not open core. It's just an open source product that you can run anywhere you want. You don't need to pay us anything for it. And we continue to develop that. And in the future, we'll have mostly SaaS products that integrate with Flynn in a way that doesn't compromise the open source nature of it.
I'm really interested in the process of applying to Y Combinator. Can you talk a bit about, as much as you want, honestly, I mean, from the process of actually pitching to, what was the real idea they bought into? Because as you said, it's sort of morphed over time. So what was the pitch then?
Yeah, applying to Y Combinator is, I guess, strange is one way of describing it. There's just a application with basically infinite questions on it, and it's really a flip of the coin whether you get an interview or not, just because there's so many applications. And after you apply, there's like an interview process where you do this rapid fire 10-minute interview with like 3 or 4 partners at YC. And I think what they really liked was that we had a working thing that allowed you to deploy apps from GitHub with basically near zero friction. And that is something that they got. And so that's why we got in.
Is this unique to you? I mean, being what you just said, like, is there anything else out there like you?
There are other platforms. I'd say the vast majority of them are limited in some way. They're either very hard to install or like not easy to install, or most of them only run stateless web applications. They don't have stateful services built in like our Postgres appliance. I'd say I don't think there's any other platform out there that is trying to do the same thing that we're doing, which is to be super easy to use, super easy to deploy and manage, and does everything you need out of a platform. You don't need additional tools or components to use with it.
So maybe give me an example of a typical Flynn production setup. Like, be agnostic if you'd like to. I mean, I'd imagine people are thinking about AWS or even our friends at DigitalOcean who sponsor the changelog, so we have an affinity towards them. But give me an idea of what it looks like to have Flynn in production. What servers are actually bare metal hardware needs to be in place. What languages people are dealing with. What are some of the things that requires Flynn to be in production? What's it like?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so we have a super easy installer that basically you install the Flynn command line tool, but you don't actually have to use the command line to install. You just type Flynn install, and it opens up in your web browser from a local web server that's in the command line tool. And there's an installation wizard that is very easy. You can point it at AWS, you can point it at DigitalOcean, Azure, or even give it SSH credentials to a few of your own hosts. So if you wanted a highly available cluster, you'd tell it to boot up 3 instances on, say, DigitalOcean, and it would tell the DigitalOcean API to boot those instances up and deploy Flynn to them and configure it, and you'd be ready to go. It would take probably about 10 minutes, and most of that is just waiting for the instances to start and install packages and so on.
So how much of that is kind of like magic inside of it to start it off easy, and how much does the developer have, I guess, control over changing that?
There's absolutely control over it. You don't have to use the installer. You can use that. We have a script that is much more minimal in that you can just run it on existing hosts. There isn't that much to configure in Flynn. We've designed that intentionally just so that you don't have to think about too much. It's just configured to work out of the box, and we're just shipping best practices with it. So you get stuff like, for instance, like I mentioned, Postgres, that's just highly available out of the box. You don't have to do any configuration whatsoever.
Is there a reason why it's Postgres and not MySQL or something else? Like maybe even Rethink or,
Yes.
insert database name here?
Right. So we started with Postgres because we wanted to keep Heroku compatibility, and Heroku has Postgres as a first-class citizen.
Okay.
So we're using Heroku build packs to deploy apps as well, but we'll be adding more data appliances in the future. So stuff like RethinkDB and Redis and MongoDB and all these things that are used quite extensively will be coming to Flynn in a way that is just as easy as our existing Postgres appliance, in that you just say, hey, I need a Mongo database for my app, and it sets that up for you.
So in your own words, what is the problem and then the dream of the developer that is like, man, Flynn is awesome, I love it?
Okay, so the problem, I assume you're asking, like, why would someone choose Flynn? Like, what problem
what does
is
it solve
solving?
for them? Yeah.
I'd say that this is the currently it is the hardest that it's ever been to deploy an application. Like, think back to when you could just FTP PHP files up to a shared host somewhere, and that worked.
Right.
And it's actually the easiest it's ever going to be to deploy apps. So there's more and more tools. You have to worry way more about security. You have to worry way more about high availability and backups and disaster recovery and so on, just because people expect way more out of the products that you're selling them on the internet as SaaS and so on. Even just a static website needs to stay up the whole time. So I'd say that is the problem that we're solving, this problem of how do I get stuff into production and keep it up and running?
So when Flynn solves a problem that was designed to solve, what's the dream of the developer? What's that look like?
Yeah, and so that is a single cluster where you can just run everything, whether that be a stateful app that is legacy in some way, or you wrote internally. Like, there's many companies out there that have they have special databases that they wrote, like a graph database that's specific to their use case and so on. You can run that on Flynn, as well as all of their apps, whether they be from like open source from GitHub, or developed internally as internal apps, or developed as customer facing stuff. All of that can be deployed on a single platform, and you don't need any other tools to manage that in production.
So all you have to do then is just pick where you want to host your stuff and have fun, I guess. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I should mention that there are definitely some areas where we're still working on it. So I'm currently working a lot on the security parts of Flynn. We basically have no internal authentication, and there's no user management and so on. So we're working really rapidly to fill out these gaps that we see as barriers to adoption.
I was reminded when you said that of your Twitter handle. Or not so much your handle, but your bio in your Twitter, and it's like security focused computer hater. I've never really heard anybody say that, but that's interesting.
Yeah, I really think that where we are with computing is it's not great. It's just computers are very unreliable. They don't do what you want them to do. They're very insecure, and so I'm working on fixing that.
Gotcha. So, Flynn, in the past when you were on with Jeff, we We talked about Doku, which was something he had written. And then you got Deus out there. And for those out there listening now and they're thinking, okay, Flynn, Doku, Deus, and XYZ that I may not have even covered that we haven't heard of yet, where does Flynn fit in? What is the future of what Flynn is in comparison to the other options out there that promise the same or similar thing like platform as a service?
It really depends on what we're talking about here. I think for the most part, we can generalize and say that there are many platforms that are like successors to Heroku in that they have basically the same functionality, except they are open source or not. There's some non-open source platforms that are Heroku clones that you can run elsewhere. And so like I think of some of the ones that you mentioned as being in that bucket. Doku is the one case where it's even more limited in that it's only designed to run on a single host and it's very, very minimal. But most of the other existing platforms they're just direct copies of Heroku in that they run stateless web applications that serve HTTP traffic.
Okay. And so I guess maybe that makes me think about what your inspiration was then. So if those seem to be successors or inspired by a Heroku situation, what was the beginning of Flynn like for you?
Definitely inspired by Heroku, but we really wanted to take it further and say, hey, I got apps that I can deploy on Heroku or a Heroku-like platform, but what about all the other stuff like my databases and like an IRC server or a mail server? Like, where do I deploy those? And the answer at the time was, you spend a while writing some configuration management scripts that are like very specific to the host you're deploying on, and you manage those separately. And our goal is to make it so that you don't have to do that. You can just deploy all of your stuff on Flynn.
When you look at the platform as a service, I guess, landscape, if dare I even say that, like, what does it make you think of? Like, does it encourage you more to what you're doing with Flynn, or are you like, wow, we've really got a blue ocean here because they're not thinking the way we're thinking? What does the landscape look like to you?
Yeah, so I think I'd rather expand that to not just platform as a service, but like there's this whole like new infrastructure space. And the focus seems to be a lot on very specific tools. So you have, a service discovery tool or a
Right.
container management tool or an overlay networking tool. All of these things are components of a well-built platform. There are very few well-built platforms, and if you don't have one of those, then you're stuck kind of gluing these tools together, and ends up being a lot of work, and it's a lot of time, and it's just not as resilient as it could be.
We already talked about getting started to a degree. We talked about being production ready. So when you say stable channel, that means that it is stable, it does work, and you are suggesting that it should be used in production. Is that correct?
Yeah, with a few caveats. So
Okay.
we definitely have people that are using it in production. There are we're certainly not bug free in that there are people are finding issues now and then, and we do fix those pretty fast. But the main thing right now is that we don't have like multi-user support or the ability to run even like close to untrusted code on the platform. So there's a bunch of like internal APIs that are exposed that we need to lock down more. That is the main thing we're focused on right now, is making sure that it's secure enough to be able to deploy anything that you found on GitHub without worrying too much about it.
This is sort of a slight tangent to a degree, but I had it down here and I can't leave this conversation without asking it, which is, what's a typical day in the life of Jonathan like? What do you do? What's Monday through Friday for you? Or is it Monday through Monday? I don't know. Or is it 7 days a week for you, or
Yeah,
what?
no, that would definitely be like Monday through Sunday.
Okay.
Yeah. So typical day looks like I have a bunch of GitHub emails in my inbox, various pull requests and issues and so on. And so I do a bunch of code review and respond to issues, catch up with people in IRC, and then get to work on my list for the day of software that I'm developing, whether that be actually software, writing documentation, and all the while like watch IRC and our internal chat for issues that come up. So we try to be super helpful in IRC. If you have any issues with Flynn, you can get a hold of us really easily. And we actually have people in different time zones, so the coverage tends to be pretty good.
We haven't really talked about the size of your team, really. What's the size of Flynn like these days?
We're about half a dozen people.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
So I guess being through Y Combinator, coming out, what is the state, I guess, of, dare I say, runway? I mean, that's really what it is. I mean, somebody's got to pay for your time. You're worth a lot, and so is the rest of your team. So there's funding, there's money there. What is it like on the funding side? Do you have a long-term partner who's like, hey, I'm just interested in the long-term future of this, pay me back when you get a chance? Or
I'd say the answer is that the funding ecosystem is complicated, and I don't really want to get too much into the weeds here, but we have no concerns about our runway,
Okay.
and hopefully, we have absolutely no concerns about the runway. We'll keep developing Flynn for the foreseeable future.
Some backstory on that question to you. Wasn't loaded, I promise, but we had a conversation with, as I mentioned before, with Slava Akhmachet, talking about Rethink DB, and Jared and I were both surprised by the patience that it, not so much that they're not doing what they should be doing, but he just seemed to have investors who were like just more flexible. I don't know how to describe it. And then obviously Mitchell, he took a little bit of funding recently with HashiCorp. And then we also had the guys behind Metabase on recently, which was also VC funded. And so we're seeing a trend here, and I can't help but ask questions of like, okay, if you're taking investment and you're building a company, but you're also completely focused on open source like you are, just not so much like a devil's advocate kind of thing, but like how do you as a software developer navigate that world, and how can you share or encourage other developers out there that have just as much dreams and ideas as you do accomplish some of their goals?
Yeah. Okay. So I think there's a few things that we should unpack here. The first one is VC funded open source, which I think the jury's still out on.
Yes.
There are a lot of new companies that have been funded recently that are working on open source, either full time or part time. Whether they have commercial products or not, there's a whole gamut of stuff. And I think the interesting question, and I don't think it's been answered yet, is how does that play out? Like, what are the business models that end up being successful? Because there are very few like successful open source companies that you can point to that have been around for a while. And I think the big one you can think of is Red Hat. And
Yep.
they have a very like relatively enterprise centric support contract business model, which works well for them. But I'm curious to see how that scales, and whether these new companies are in that same position. We're very focused on not compromising the open source nature of the project. So as I mentioned before, we really don't want to do open core, which is where you have like enterprise features that you're selling, and you're actually selling binary software to run on servers. And we're just not interested in doing that. So we're really focused on how can we be successful as a company without having to compromise the open source nature of the project. And so far, we think the answer to that is SaaS products that are like really a huge value add to Flynn without having to install any binary proprietary software on your computer. And the other thing that is worth discussing is this, like, if I have an open source project, how do I, take it to the next level? And I don't know the answer to that. I know that one answer is absolutely raising venture capital. It is complicated, and it really depends on your situation. Like, that's a very person specific thing. Yeah. I
kind of figured that, because it's I figured with Y Combinator it would just make sense, the process of going through that, and you obviously get exposed to a lot of people who are willing to invest. So through that, you might come out with new connections, maybe no particular ties with YC. I don't know what the terms are, but I think usually it's like 5% or 10%. They take some sort of equity into.
They take 7%. They give you $120,000.
Yeah.
And the big deal with Y Combinator is you get to go to demo day, which they have a whole bunch of like early stage investors.
Right.
And so it ends up being relatively easy compared to not going through Y Combinator to raise a seed round of $1 million or $2 or $3 million.
Any other particular insights or advice that if you had the ear of the open source world on accepting money, taking VC, what this process is like for you? Anything you else want to share?
I think that it's important to think really carefully about the goals of the project before you're considering funding, and how the funding will impact that. So whether you can find investors who are willing to like go with the open source nature, or whether they will pull you towards selling proprietary products, which that's definitely happened.
So you'd mentioned that some particular SaaS models that you have ideas for. Is there? I'm not asking for product names or whatnot, but is there anything in particular you can share about what the future of, I guess, revenue generating things will be for Flynn? Is it too early?
I think it's too early. We're like super focused right now on getting people happy with Flynn. So if you are like have the problem that we're trying to solve, which is deploying stuff is too hard and takes too long, and you need something like Flynn, then we're really interested in getting you using Flynn. And that is our focus 100%. And our investors understand that and are totally up for that. And so I think that the monetization will come a bit later after we have this really great core of community and we already have over 90 contributors to the open source project, and our IRC is pretty active. We're super interested in building out the user base and community of Flynn.
As when we were talking a bit earlier about the day in the life of Jonathan, I was thinking, okay, you got 237 open issues right now in the Flynn repo. So your day must be pretty busy just considering the traffic of issues on the project alone. I think you mentioned the popularity a bit. So 4,025 stars. So it's definitely popular. If you have the ear of the open source world to step in and help out, how could our listeners step in and say, okay, I'm interested in Flynn. How can I be of service? What can I do from an open source perspective to move things along with you?
Yeah, there's lots of cool stuff to do. So the very easiest is absolutely just installing Flynn and trying it out with your apps at work or your side projects and so on, and seeing if it works for you. And if it doesn't, telling us why it's not working. And we really want to fix that. If you actually want to commit some code or docs, there's lots of stuff to do. There's the reason why there's so many issues is we actually track feature requests on GitHub too. So there's we've got an easy tag on GitHub, and if you just click on the easy tag, you should see a bunch of like things that you could get done in an hour or less. And Flynn is really easy to contribute to. It's written in Go, and we have a development environment that spins up in a VM using Vagrant, so you can just have like one command and be ready to go and work like develop Flynn locally.
I love this easy tag. It's so cool. You got 52 open issues. Yeah, I don't like that they call them issues either, because it's not doesn't mean like you got 230 whatever bugs out there. It's the legitimate community focused conversations basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
This easy tag is really interesting though. I don't know if we connected a little bit there or had a bit of a lag. I was just talking about the easy tag. I think it's really interesting. I don't know if I've seen that before. Where did you get that idea from for an easy tag?
To be honest, I don't really remember. I think I've seen it in a few repos. I couldn't name one off the top of my head. The idea though of having these like relatively small chunks of work that don't require a ton of knowledge and get you started contributing to the project. I'm really excited to help new contributors work on Flynn, because it's really neat to see the new perspectives, and it's always nice having someone else write code for you.
Yeah, whenever you can get the community to step in and help out with the actual mission of the project is always going to be a good thing. So
yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I guess we really haven't talked too much about language, but I know Flynn's been written in Go since the beginning. Am I right on saying that?
That's absolutely correct.
Okay, so having been what's about 3 or 4 years old now, the project?
Yeah, we started in like July, end of July, like August 2013.
Okay,
so 2.5 years.
So that's about 2 years after Go was actually written, maybe 3 years after it went public.
Yeah, I want to say we started with like Go 1.2 or so. Okay.
And the reason why I'm asking that is I'm just kind of getting a heartbeat on like your happiness level with Go.
Quite happy. Yeah, I have no meaningful complaints. Go is really great because it allows our new contributors to get up and running really quickly. It's not a hard language to pick up, and you can come to it from any other language. So whether you used to program in, you're a C kernel hacker or you wrote Rails apps, you can contribute to Flynn using the Go language really easily.
Has there been any other attraction for you to other languages like Rust or Crystal or anything else you can think of that might have drawn your attention? Not that Go isn't good enough, but has there been any other attraction to other languages that make you think man, if Flynn would have been written in that, it might be better.
I keep trying to find an excuse to do something in Rust. And I have I've been reading some Rust projects recently. I haven't actually written any. That is the only language that I think I would be that I think has a future currently in Flynn. I'm always excited to see new languages that people are targeting at production, because there's kind of a few different classes of programming languages that people develop, and only a few of them seem to be really laser focused on use in production. And I think that is something that the Go community has gotten sorted out.
If you had the ear of the Go community, which I'm sure you do on your own anyways, not just with our help, but any sort of congratulations, anything in particular you want to say back to the Go community that you're excited about with Go?
I think that just in general, the quality of the community is great. There's a really strong focus on just on writing code and doing stuff with code, as opposed to kind of rehashing the language, which I think is, some people get upset about, the Go people aren't super interested in changing the language. But from the perspective of someone who's using this all day, every day, it's a solid language. It has, everyone, I think there are reasonable complaints about some of it, but it's overall really, really, really easy to get started with. And the quality of the tooling is pretty great. I think the last thing that is problematic in Go is the whole vendoring and package management situation, but they are finally sorting that out. So in the next few releases, we should have that totally fixed.
Did you happen to make it to GopherCon this past year?
I did not, unfortunately.
Did you make it to any GopherCon?
No, I've never been to GopherCon. I've mostly been holed up working on Flynn. I haven't
too
really
busy, right?
I haven't really been out to any conferences. The first conference I'm going to this year is at the end of the year, 32C3.
I'd be really interested to, because we plan to be a part of GopherCon next year. I'd be really interested to see a talk submitted from you on just a lot of the stuff you've done. Because it seems like you're solving really interesting high-level problems that you can share a lot back to the Go community. And when we were there, it was really, really interesting. And a lot of the things you're saying about the Go community, we saw that firsthand. So you have that perspective without going to the Go conference.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm definitely going to consider what conferences to submit talks to this upcoming year.
Cool. Well, all right, let's tail up the show then. So github.com/Flynn is the org on Flynn. You got flynn.io, so that's FLYNN, so 2 N's, .io. And I never even mentioned this, but your tagline on the homepage is just stunning. Throw away the duct tape, say hello to Flynn. Just in retrospective of our conversation here, it's fitting, very fitting.
Thanks.
And then you're also available on Twitter at Titanius. That's TITANOUS, twitter.com, of course. So, Jonathan, thanks so much for taking the time to come back on and just catch us up with what you're doing. I'm super encouraged by what's going on. Is there anything else you want to cover before we close out?
No, thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. It's a pleasure to have you back on the show. In that case, let's go ahead and say goodbye then. Bye, everyone.
Bye.